I'm very comfortable here on the stage with somebody who has been accused even more than I have of having completely insane views on many topics, including economics. So today will be fun. We have 1 hour in which to resolve all the problems of capitalism. So I'm sure we will have no trouble in doing that. So let me begin by inviting him to give a short talk about the secret history of capitalism, and then we will have a discussion.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Economics is not exactly the most interesting subject in the world, so I'll try to make it worth your while by making it a bit more fun than your usual economics lecture. Let me start with a story. In 1958, Japan tried to export its first passenger cars to the United States. The car was made by a company called Toyota, and it was called Toyopet. And as you can guess from the name, it was a cheap, small car, more of a 4 wheels and an ashtray kind of a car. And Toyota hoped that this car was so cheap that prosperous American consumers will buy them with changes left over from their grocery shopping. Unfortunately, it was a total flop. Please show the next slide. Slide, please. Yeah, because it looked like that. Yeah. Would you buy that car? I wouldn't. So Toyota was totally humiliated, and it actually officially withdrew the car from the U.S. market. Some of you have seen the movie Men in Black, yeah? The neuralizer. Yeah? So it was like, this car was never here. Forget about it. Yeah? Now, naturally, this created a huge controversy in Japan. The free market economists centered around the central bank, Bank of Japan, argued that, look, this is what happens when you go against the received wisdom in economics called the theory of comparative advantage, which says that a labor-rich country like Japan should be exporting labor-intensive products, not capital-intensive products like motor cars. And indeed, at the time, the biggest export item of Japan was silk. And the Japanese car industry was a joke. Yeah? And I don't use that word lightly. I don't have figures for 1958, but in 1955, the United States produced 7 million cars. General Motors alone produced 3.5 million. All the 12 Japanese car companies put together produced 70,000 cars. The biggest company, Toyota, produced 35,000. Yeah, so the free market economists had a very strong case. And they were very glad to point out, look, that it's not as if this industry didn't have any help. It had all the help you can reasonably expect. It has been protected with a high tariff for 25 years since its foundation in 1933. It has been protected from foreign companies because after Japan kicked out General Motors and Ford back in 1938 in the build-up to the Pacific War, they never let those companies in again. So the Japanese companies had the local market to themselves. And the central bank economists are particularly pleased to point out that back in 1949, we bailed Toyota out with public money. So don't tell us that you haven't had help. Let's now admit the reality. Let's scrap protection. Let's accept foreign investment, and let's be done with it. Now, today we think of Japanese cars as something as natural as, I don't know, Scottish salmon or French wine, but only 2 generations ago, a lot of people, including a lot of Japanese, thought this industry should not exist. Well, luckily for Japan, and I would say for the rest of the world, which has eventually benefited from better cars made in Japan, the protectionists won the debate, and the Japanese government continued with its support for the industry. And by the 1970s, the Japanese the companies conquered the small car market, and the rest is history. Today, next slide, please. Toyota cars, slide. Yeah, look like that. So this is one of the luxury models, Lexus. So given this history, when you meet a free trade economist next time, ask him what car he drives. If he drives a Japanese, or for that matter, Korean cars, which were developed in the same way, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, I can give you many more examples like Toyota and other companies are from Japan and Korea, but when I do that, free trade economists come back and say, yeah, but Japan and Korea are the exceptions. All the other rich countries have developed on the basis of free trade and free market model. So, you can't sell those as the examples, But the truth is that virtually all of today's rich countries developed by using policies like protectionism, regulation of foreign direct investment, state ownership of companies, government subsidies, and other measures. Now, this goes right back to Britain, which is a country that people think invented free trade, but actually Britain is a country that invented protectionism rather than free trade. Until the 17th century, Britain was a backward economy dependent on the export of raw wool. And at the time, the high-tech industry of Europe was woolen manufacturing, centered around the so-called Low Countries, what are the Netherlands and Belgium today, and Britain was the raw material producer. And the British realized that this is not going to make them a rich nation. So, from the 14th century on, but especially from the 17th century, Britain started promoting its 16th century, Britain started promoting its woolen manufacturing industry by taxing the exports of raw wool so that producers would sell to domestic manufacturers, by giving tariff protection to domestic woolen textile manufacturers, and even by banning the imports of superior textile like Indian calico. And this is the beginning of British industrial development. Especially after the next slide, please. Robert Walpole, the so-called first British Prime Minister, came to power in 1721. Can I have next slide, please? Yeah, that's the man. Britain launched a trade and industrial policy program that resembled very closely to what countries like Japan and Korea did, used later in the 20th century. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through that, but for anyone who's interested, I'm just showing the kind of policies that Walpole used. And between Robert Walpole and the 1850s, before it switched over to free trade, Britain implemented the most aggressive protectionist program. And indeed, next slide, please. Until the early 19th century, Britain had one of the highest tariff rates in the world. And it's on the basis of these historical facts that Friedrich List, the 19th century German economist, condemned the British advocacy of free trade in the 19th century as an act equivalent to kicking away the ladder. Next slide, please. So in this passage, List is saying look, the British tell us the Germans and the Americans, he very much associated himself with the Americans. He actually was exiled in the US for quite a while. He said the British tell us to use free trade, but when you actually look at British history, when did they use free trade? Never until now. And now they are advocating free trade only because their industry has no competitor. This is like someone using a ladder, next slide please, to climb to the top and kicking the ladder away so that other people cannot follow. That's the cover of my earlier academic book published in 2002. Now, if Britain was the first country to have succeeded by a protectionist program, the first country to have theorized the practice is none other than the United States. And the person who invented this theory is an American who is so famous that most of you even know what he looks like, even though he's been dead for about 200 years, except that you don't know who he is. Next slide, please. It's that guy, Alexander Hamilton, the first ever Treasury Secretary of the United States, with his face on the $10 bill. And next slide, please. For younger audience, he's better known for this musical. You know, Hamilton became the US Treasury Secretary at the outrageously young age of 33. And 2 years later, he submits this report to the US Congress called the Treasury Secretary's Report on the Subject of Manufacturers. Actually, this is an amazing document. Despite being nearly 250 years old, this document is a most sophisticated economic development plan. I mean, of course, at the heart of it was what is known as the infant industry argument. I'll get to that in a minute. But it wasn't just about trade protection. It was about developing the banking system, investment in infrastructure, developing intellectual property rights system, developing the government bond market. You know, he was a visionary. At the core of it, as I said, was this idea of infant industry protection, which is a very simple but a very powerful idea. And in order to explain this in an intuitive way, next slide please, I have a chapter in that book, Bad Samaritans, called My 6-year-old Son Should Get a Job. Now, in the chapter, I start by saying, well, of course, I don't use such strong language in the book, but I basically start by saying that my son is a parasite. No, I mean, he's totally dependent on me. I mean, of course, he's now 16, but at the time he was 6, and I paid for everything. His food, his lodging, his heating, his water, his education, his health care, his Nintendo games, And then I got thinking, look, actually this guy can work. Yeah, you go to India, you go to Ecuador, you go to Mozambique. I mean, there are children who are working from the age of 4 or 5. So why should I pay for this? And then I realized that this is actually a win-win solution. Because if I made him work, not only would I save all this money, but he would also become a better person. Yeah, no more wasting time in front of TV, no more wasting time in front with Nintendo games, He will have to practice, whatever his trade is, I don't know, the shoe shining, chewing gum selling, door catching, whatever. Yeah, so he'll be a very competitive person because he's honing his skills from a very young age. So why do I not do this? For that matter, why do other economists don't do it, who praise competition? Well, I don't know about other people, but my reason is He's quite a clever kid. If I invested in him for another 12, maybe 15 years, he could become lots of things. Yeah? At the moment, he wants to become a biologist, but, at the time I reasoned, he could become a neurosurgeon or, a nuclear physicist or an architect. But if I kick him into the labor market when he's 6, if he works really hard, probably he'll end up owning a small shop. Yeah? But there's a snowball's chance in hell for him to become a nuclear physicist or neurosurgeon. So that's in a nutshell the idea of infant industry protection. Of course, there's a danger that this guy will remain dependent on me. He could, be 33 and don't have a job and live with me, like, what's that person's name? Yeah, Jesus Christ did. He was unemployed until he was 33, wasn't he? But even if there's half a chance that this would happen, I would still invest in him because the other alternative is so horrible to think about. And of course, you have to do it well. You have to increase his independence. You have to demand performance. To put it very simply, I can send him to school, but he has to work. So, I'm not saying that protection itself solves the problem, but that creates the environment in which industries can raise productivity, which requires investment in machines, technology, worker training, and things like that. So that sounds like a no-brainer, but unfortunately, the next slide, please. That was not the prevailing opinion. That's the cover of the American version. The next one, please. Unfortunately, that was not the prevailing opinion of the time. None less than Adam Smith, in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, was explicitly telling the Americans not to industrialize. He said it is bad for you. And indeed, this was the opinion shared by many other Americans, like Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton's political archenemy. They said, look, we can export our cotton and tobacco to Europe and buy things that are not only better, but also cheaper, even including the transportation cost, than these shoddy products manufactured by the Yankees. Why should we subsidize those people? So actually, Hamilton initially lost the argument. He couldn't push through his plan, but over time, Americans are so sensing his argument, and the next slide, please, started moving into protectionist policy from the 1810s, and as you can see from the table, until the between the 1830s and the Second World War, the US remained the most protected economy in the world. Same story applies to other rich countries today. Next slide, please. I'm not going to really go through this, but just to, next slide. In terms of trade, except for the Netherlands and Switzerland, they all use protectionism. Next slide. Next one. Next slide, please. We have to go one more. One more, please. No, one more. I thought I was going to be able to control this. So, and many of these countries are very tightly regulated foreign direct investment when they were at the receiving end of foreign direct investment. So the US in the 19th century regulated foreign investment very heavily. Same story, Japan and Finland, to a lesser extent, Korea and Taiwan. The next one. And many of them used state-owned enterprises when they saw the need, especially remarkable is Singapore. When you read about Singapore in the sort of financial newspapers or standard books on global capitalism, you will only hear about this free trade policy and welcoming attitude towards foreign investors, which it has. But you will never be told that a staggering 22% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises, 90% of land is owned by the government, and 85% of housing is provided through the government-owned housing board. So I often tell my graduate students, give me one economic theory that can single-handedly explain Singapore. There's no such theory. It doesn't matter what it is, neoclassical Marxist, Austrian, there's no such theory. Anyway, so that, Singapore, France, Finland, even the US, people think the US has no government involvement, at least these days, in industrial development. No, actually they have the biggest industrial policy program in the world. Only that it's not called industrial policy, it's called military research. No, seriously, I mean, my friend Mariana Mazzucato became famous for writing this article, which showed that just about every piece of technology contained in an iPhone originally come from US military research. Microchips, which was financed by the US Navy, the GPS, I mean, the very ideal computer, that's the US defense research program as well. Internet was invented by this agency called DARPA of the State Department. It's endless. The next one, same story with the intellectual property rights. I'm not going to go into that. So my point is that the real history, or the secret history, if you like, of capitalism is almost the polar opposite of the official history, in which all the successful countries, with the possible exception of Japan, Korea, and today's China, have become rich through free trade and free market. Now, the crazy thing is that in order to find this information, I didn't have to hack into some secret database of the International Monetary Fund, or I don't know, go to some Italian monastery to read some 17th century manuscript. No, the information is all there in the library with a little help from the internet. But the history of capitalism has been rewritten so much that we don't even know that it has been rewritten. So it's like this. Next slide, please. That's a famous picture from the Russian Revolution. And of course, you see Vladimir Lenin at the center, and possibly that many of you recognize the man standing on his left, which is Leon Trotsky. And then there's the man standing next to Lenin, who is called Kamenev, who was Trotsky's brother-in-law, one-time editor of Pravda, so was quite a big fish. Now, when Stalin came to power, he couldn't let this kind of picture be seen, so he let the KGB doctor the picture. You have to go 3 clicks and another one. Yeah, that's Lenin. One more. Yeah, and then another one. Yeah. One more click, please. Yeah, so he doctored the picture and wiped the Trotsky and Kamenev out of the picture. So one more click. So he said, look, I mean, it was all done by Lenin with a bit of help from me. There's no such person as Trotsky or Kamenev around. So the history of capitalism is a bit like this. Next click, please. At the center of it, of course, was the market. Click, please. But then another click, there's also protection, another click, and regulation. Yeah? But now you are told Another click, please. Now you are told that, yeah, another click. It's all been done by the market. Huh? I'm not saying that there's some secret committee in the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank rewriting history and airbrushing people out of pictures. But the result is even more impressive than what Stalin achieved, because people don't even know that this has been rewritten. So next click, please. Welcome to the Matrix. Okay, I have a few more things to say, but probably for the sake of the discussion and debate, I will be very, very brief. So this is the history of capitalism, and then we are told by the rich countries that, look, I mean, all these policies you are using, they are crazy. Huh? When you look at their history, you know it's not true. So you go back to them with that, and they say, oh yeah, probably, I didn't know about that, but at least we know that. I mean, these policies didn't work. In the developing countries, when they try to use protectionism and so on, they didn't work. So you shouldn't use this. Yeah? But this is like arguing that, look, some people went to school and didn't do well, so we should abolish schools. Yeah? No, because I mean, lots of the wrong things were done in the 50s and 60s and 70s in some developing countries. But this is not, I mean, a proof against the fundamental idea of infant industry protection. Huh? The method was wrong, and probably the goal was also wrong. So probably the easiest way to make this point is to compare South Korea, Brazil, and India in those days. So the Brazilians, none of these countries could build nice cars in the 50s and 60s. But the Brazilians said, we cannot build nice cars, but we want nice cars. So let's invite the foreign companies like Renault and Fiat and Ford and ask them to come and build nice cars for us so that we can drive around in these nice cars. The Indian approach was, nice cars are imperialist conspiracy. We don't want nice cars. So they kept reproducing 1950s Austin Ambassador, and by the 80s, that car became an international joke. Yeah? Well, it's not that even as if you invented that car. It's an old British model. Yeah? The Korean approach was, well, we cannot build nice cars, so we are going to drive around in shit cars until we can build nice cars. Yeah? And that's what they did. Yeah? I mean, initially, Hyundai, which is also big in India, this is a company whose daily production of cars was 6. Yeah? So over the whole year, even if they work 365 days, 2,000 cars. Yeah? I still remember in 1977, there's a huge kind of headline in the Korean newspapers saying, Korea export its first cars. Yeah? It turns out that we sold 6 cars to Ecuador. Yeah? Where we probably paid them to buy the cars. Yeah? But the point is that according to the free market orthodoxy, that kind of industry should be scrapped. Yeah? And then what would have Korea ended up with? Yeah? We don't even have enough raw material to export. Yeah? So it would have remained a very poor country. Yeah? So the principle is the right one. Yeah? Of course, the execution and exactly why you are doing it. Yeah? If you are doing it to preserve some 1950s British technology, it doesn't work. But insofar as your final goal is to join the global economy on the higher terms, this is the only way to do it. Yeah? Unfortunately, today, developing countries are put under constant pressure from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and through various bilateral and regional agreements to liberalize their trade, no matter what the state of the economy is, no matter what the state of the industry is. And this is something that we have to change if we are going to build a more pro-developmental global economic system. Thank you.
Thank you, Ha-Joon. That was an excellent presentation. I myself have a lot of sympathy for this East Asian worldview. I've spent much of my adult life living in Singapore, so I very much understand where you're coming from. And in fact, I've dressed up today in solidarity. But what you're basically arguing for, from what I can tell, is basically a mercantilist, state-led capitalism. Now, when we say state-led capitalism, now, very often the problem happens is, one, that the emphasis goes on to the state-led bit and not to the capitalism bit, because it's very easy, if you emphasize the state-led bit, that instead of getting South Korea, you end up with North Korea. So what are the principles, you can say, sort of rules of thumb, that you would advise to make sure that you stick to this straight and narrow path of state-led capitalism without, ending up at the wrong place?
Yeah, no, this is not an easy act to pull off. This is why so many countries have failed in their attempt. But yeah, so I would say that there are a few principles that you have to abide by. First is that you have to always tell yourself and tell your people and tell others that you are doing this so that you can join the global economy in better terms in the long run. Yeah? You are not doing this to freeze the status quo. I mean, North Korea is a very good example. They live under this illusion that they have kind of a totally independent economy, not relying on foreign capital, foreign technology. But the economy essentially runs on 1930s Japanese and 1950s Soviet technologies. Yeah?
Yeah.
So what's so great about it? Yeah? So the goal should be to join the global economy, but you want to be prepared. Yeah?
Yeah.
Because once if you open up too early, then your producers will be wiped out. Yeah? So that's the first principle, and the second is to get over this kind of dichotomous ideological itself with state is somehow left wing, market is somehow right wing, protection is somehow mercantilist, the free trade is somehow liberal. No, in some situations, free trade is the opposite of liberal. India should know it from its experience when the British imposed free trade on it. Yeah? So, you have to get over that and pursue a pragmatic route. Singapore is the supreme example there. How do you call it?
Yeah.
A state with 90% public ownership in land,
Yeah.
and free trade. Yeah?
Yeah.
22% of GDP produced by state-owned enterprises, and global headquarters of multinational companies.
Yep.
So I think that on this, I very much go with Mr. Deng Xiaoping, who famously said that it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as well as catches mice. Yeah? So get rid of ideological obsession. But thirdly, that it should, this is the most difficult bit. It should be based on the checks and balances. Yeah? Because if you, we are seeing it in many countries. Even if you did this kind of thing very well, it can quickly degenerate if you're not careful. Yeah? So you need to be transparent. You need to strengthen the democracy so that there will be checks and balances. Because when you have these programs, there's always a temptation to cut a deal with between the government officials and some big company, and then say, well, we are doing it for the nation, you shut up. Yeah? So I think that, when I say democracy, I don't necessarily mean kind of Western style democracy, but there has to be continuous oversight and vigilance and checks and balances on the abuse of state and corporate power.
Now, since you mentioned black and white cats. Now the problem is at least you need a competent cat. And this is important because you see when you're allowing for a model with a state is going to have such a large role, leadership will matter a lot. It cannot be a neutral system. Now, it's all very well if you end up with Lee Kuan Yew as your leader. But if you have a system, it's quite possible that you will end up with the Kim family of North Korea or the Castro brothers, or as we did in India, we ended up with the Nehru-Gandhi family. And so then what happens is that these levers of power are then used to perpetuate an elite or a family. How do you avoid that problem? Ex ante, it's all very get ex post if it has worked, but ex ante, how do you resolve that problem?
This is where I emphasize the importance of democracy, because without institutionalized mechanism to remove incompetent leaders, this doesn't work. I mean, of course.
How about China? I mean, then China is a very fragile system.
But what you have to realize is that they have somehow created this system where no one is in power for more than 10 years. Right. No, I mean,
so the current leadership is attempting to circumvent that.
Sorry?
The current leadership, from what we gather, is attempting to extend its stay. So
I hope not. I mean, because that will be the death of the model. Because China has been doing this successfully only because there's intense internal competition within the Chinese Communist Party, and this rule that no one's going to be there for more than 10 years.
Right.
So I think that democracy is very important here, and without that, you will end up with this kind of dictatorships. But I think on this issue of dynastic succession, which your country and my country are at the moment suffering from, I think that we could just introduce a rule that anyone who's a relative of a former kind of top office holders like the president or prime minister cannot run for public office. Yeah.
Ooh, that'll be a difficult one in this country.
Yes.
They'll have to remove large parts of our parliament in that case. But I mean, related to this, I mean, your country, my country went through crony socialism. Yours went through crony capitalism. And the one thing that we learned out of this is that you end up always with the cronies. Now, as we speak, the head of Samsung is being investigated, may actually go to jail. Now, there is a serious issue here about rule of law. Now, any neutral kind of rule of law system would be very difficult to manage, because in the end, the state-led system that you mentioned requires you to choose. So how do we decide that? And it relates to this business about the leadership. It's very easy ex post to say, this guy did the right thing, but ex ante, very difficult to decide how do we have a system which is deliberately skewed in a certain way.
Yes, you need institutionalized mechanism to choose the priority industries and so on. So even at the height of military dictatorship in Korea, you had the planning board, you had the Ministry of Industry, you had all these industry associations working closely together, continuously producing white papers and green papers and whatnot, putting things into public domain. I mean, of course, there was no discussion of politics, but when it comes to what industry to promote and which company to support, I mean, there was a very high degree of openness and scrutiny. And, democracy, you need that, you can do even more than that, but I think that exactly for this reason, you need clear plans, because the best way to kind of do this chronistic deal is to pretend that you are doing free market, and there's no principle to follow and check what you are doing, and then you cut these deals. So actually, not planning in the sense of Soviet, compulsive planning, but planning, vision statement, the white papers. I mean, these things have to be out there so that people can continuously say, no, that wasn't your goal. I mean, why are you giving this deal to this company? So I think that openness and transparency is the key.
Now, one of the things that you do, of course, is mock the Washington consensus and all the business of the IMF and World Bank and other foreign experts who go around the world lecturing them on what to do. And it's not just the free marketeers, you also have global experts from various NGOs and others and floating around. And my sense is that you are, at the very least, very skeptical and suspicious of foreign experts. Now, is that the case? One. And two, is it the case that in many cases they are deliberately giving you the wrong advice and kicking away their letter? Or is it the case that that's just how the ideological positioning is?
Yeah. No, on the first point, no, I mean, I go to foreign countries and talk to people, So
should we be suspicious of you?
Yeah. But, so I cannot possibly be against that. But what is important is that foreigners should not have the decision-making power or the money. Yeah? Because that's, I go to some government and give a lecture, it's up to them to absorb this or that or, that's their business. Yeah? I'm there to tell them about some theories, some foreign experiences. That can be useful. Yeah? But once I come with money, even if I don't do it explicitly, they'll try to listen to me because I come with the money, or I come with political power. So I am against foreign expertise linked with money and power.
Backed by any kind of money. So whether it's XYZ Foundation or the World Bank,
it could
you're
be
suspicious.
Yeah. So that's how I see it. And on the second one, I think unfortunately economists these days are so undereducated in history. Most of them don't know this stuff, so I don't say that they are actually doing it deliberately. Yeah? Most economists genuinely believe that...
Genuine ignorance.
That's right, yeah. Well, that's actually even more dangerous, If someone is doing something, thinking that they are doing something good to you, that's the most dangerous thing.
No, I agree with you. In fact, much of this, I write about economic history and geographical history. One of the things that strikes you is that, in fact, there is virtually no example of the world being in equilibrium. India and Rome traded for hundreds of years, and India ran current account surplus with Rome for hundreds of years through that period. And that is why India kept demanding the payment in gold, and as a result, even today, India is the largest store of gold in the world because of this disequilibrium system. Whereas today, even if you run a decade of disequilibrium and say, oh my God, this is global imbalance and must be corrected. So I fully appreciate what you're trying to say. But bringing this to a more contemporary context, you heard Trump yesterday, in his presidential speech, in his first presidential speech, he outlined an economic model which has in many ways many of the elements you just described. He's talking about heavy investment. Much of it probably will be state-led because it's infrastructure. He talks about going back to higher tariffs, and now whether or not he manages to do it, whether the system will allow him to do it is a different issue. But would you agree that he is attempting to do precisely what you are recommending?
Well, I couldn't bring myself to listening to him yet, so I don't know exactly what he said yesterday, but he's been saying things, so I know roughly what he wants to do. No, but what I'm advocating is that what I call asymmetric protectionism. If you are at the top of the food chain, you shouldn't protect. There are some sectors, some weak sectors you might have to do. There might have to be some transitional things where you have to use protectionism. So I'm not saying no protectionism whatsoever if you're the US or the EU. But the general principle that I advocate is that when you are the most developed countries, you should have minimum protection. And as you go down the kind of the food chain, the weakest guy should be, allowed to do
per capita GDP calibrated protectionism.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, roughly. Yeah. No.
Okay, I think we have a few more minutes to go, so we'll ask a few questions. There are lots of them. So can you please, distribute a mic around, and I'm sure we'll have some interest. Again, Sanjay Baru, right in the middle over there, if you can hand him a mic.
Following from the Trump question, Xi Jinping in Davos. I mean, it's very interesting that the Chinese president gives a speech defending globalization, and the American president gives a speech defending protectionism. We are at a very interesting moment in this discussion. I would like to get your views on that.
I mean, is this a case where the positions have changed and hence the ladders they're climbing or kicking have changed?
Yes, to an extent, but I think you have to take these with, more than a grain, a bag of salt from both people, because as you alluded to, Mr. Trump can't just do what he says. To begin with, the U.S. is a member of the World Trade Organization. It's got free trade agreements with Mexico, Canada, South Korea, Australia. He can't just raise his tariffs. But most importantly, if he tries to raise his tariff, American corporations will be up in arms. Because if he slaps 35% tariff on the Chinese imports, it means that Nike shoes and iPhone and all these things are going to be 35% more expensive. American consumers wouldn't swallow it. American corporations will be up in arms. This is just a rhetoric. He can't do it. As for Mr. Xi Jinping, there are sectors where China is very strong and would benefit from free trade, but there are other sectors where they still need protection. The current economic structure of China is that it imports machines from Germany, Japan, and South Korea and produces consumer goods for the US. So when it comes to the machine sectors, higher technology sectors, China still needs protection. So he's talking about these things so that he can at least defend the Chinese industries in areas where they are stronger. But if you really push it and tell him, would you then abolish all tariffs everywhere, he wouldn't do it.
Not just tariffs. You can't use Gmail in China. So there are many other things that the services sector is much more.
Even more. Yeah.
Can we have another question? Where is and maybe after this you take it somewhere to the back, because the people in front otherwise get. Yes, can you ask the question, please?
Hello. My question is, why do you think that protectionism is positively correlated to growth and not negatively correlated to growth? Yes, the Western countries did have protectionist policies when they were growing, but it does not mean that the protectionist policies help the Western countries grow. And even if it is correlated, correlation does not imply causation. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, of course, when it comes to this historical information, you cannot prove anything beyond the shadow of doubt. But one thing, the first thing I can tell you is that, protectionism at least coexisted with economic development in those countries. Free trade wasn't even there. So it cannot possibly be the explanation for their development. And secondly, when people say, well, isn't it mere coexistence or the correlation rather than causation, but that is assuming that there is no logical merit in the theory of the infant industry protection. There are reasons, and it doesn't guarantee success, but there are very good reasons why this might actually lead to the economic development. So I would say that.
Can you give it to the right, to the back, gentlemen? Yeah.
Hi, Sanjeev. My question is to you, and I take it from Mr. Chang's statement that at one point in time, Korea produced shitty cars, and then they moved on to produce world-class cars. Now, we live in India, and we have this strange situation that we have a Tata's that owns the Jaguar and all the Land Rovers, and we still have to pay taxes to get these cars when the manufacturers are Indians. So how do you see this dichotomy in this world today, that we are paying through our nose to get a Land Rover, where then it's available in England for half or one-third the price?
Actually, this is a very, very interesting question, and particularly interesting because essentially the Tatas sell Jaguars and Land Rovers to the rest of the world and sell us nanos. So one could argue that that is market segmentation, but I agree with you. This is, in some awkward way, a market failure. That there clearly is demand for better technology cars here. There are high-end cars being manufactured by others. Our own, one of our leading manufacturing houses doesn't deem it worthwhile to do it here. I have no great insight into Tata Sons, but I assume that this is part of the peculiarities, or I would say the inefficiencies of a purely market-determined system, which is clearly not giving us this outcome and is possibly driven by the internal politics of a business house. I don't, as I said, don't know why they choose to do this, but I agree that this is a very peculiar situation. I offer no explanation, I'm afraid. Yes. Yeah. Do we have time for? Okay, so we can go on with a few more questions. And yeah, can you also give it to a lady? Yes. Yeah, there you go, Sujata. Yeah.
You emphasize that democracy will allow us to, allow state-sponsored capitalism in a sense. India had democracy from the 50s through the 80s with a short break for the emergency. We had a free press, and the Indian government tried to implement many of the policies you've suggested. We had sort of state-directed capital, not a free market, but considerable protection for industry for all those years. Whereas Taiwan and South Korea, with much less democracy, industrialized and did much better. And the political scientists all attribute this to strong states, not correlated with democracy. So what would be
Yes,
the response?
when I say democracy, I interpret it more broadly than formal democracy. So it's a question of checks and balances. So, when you have chronistic politics, dynastic politics, it's not as effective as other forms of democracy or even non-democracy. But also I must point out that there are many European countries in which they conducted this kind of industrial policy under very well-functioning democracy. Sweden, Finland, Norway, Austria, France, these are all examples. So I think that the idea of a strong state, simply because that it's a kind of democracy, it doesn't mean that states in Sweden or Finland are weak. No, they're actually incredibly strong states. They are states which are able to make the top earners pay 60% income tax rate. So, the strength of state is related to, but it's not the same as the existence of non-existence of formal democracy. So that, it's that how the system functions rather than the formality of it. But, at the very general level, I go with Winston Churchill, who said that democracy is the worst economic system except all the others.
Yes.
What is your
You
view?
need to stand up so that we can see you. Yes.
What is your view on the intellectual property regime and how that plays into the free trade debate?
Right, yeah. Well, basically my view is that intellectual property rights is, well, I mean, I actually had a slide. I mean, basically when countries were in need of absorbing other people's technologies and ideas, they all had very weak protection for intellectual property rights. You know? They stole center right and left. You know? I mean, in many countries, France, Britain, Netherlands, in the old days, it was possible to patent someone else's technology as far as that someone else is a foreigner. You know, that Switzerland and the Netherlands refused to introduce the patent protection until the early 20th century. You know, the Japanese in the 1950s was so desperate to increase export, it started producing things that were labeled made in USA, which is a small town near Tokyo, spelled USA. Yeah? You know, Koreans today complain, oh, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, they pirate copy our movies and CDs, but give me a break. You know, I grew up listening to the pirate copied rock and roll LPs. You know, we studied with pirate copied textbooks. Yeah? We didn't have money. Yeah? So yes, I mean once again you need graded protection here, but inversely to international trade. So in the rich countries, I mean even there's a problem. I mean you can have stronger protection for intellectual property, but as you get poorer, you should give less and less, and even no protection, because otherwise there's no way developing countries can develop. Because in the end, what distinguishes the rich countries from the poor countries is the amount of knowledge that they have and control.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, even the industrialization in the 18th and 19th century of the Western Europe, enormous amounts of technology were just blatantly stolen from countries like India. I mean, the calico textile industry was essentially, the technology was stolen from Surat by a French missionary who took it to Europe and replicated it. Similarly, large plantation spice and sugarcane growing was again technologies that, particularly the French, who were good at this, stole from the East Indies and transplanted it in the Caribbean and other places.
Yeah. No, France actually at one point had this public office called the Inspector General for Foreign Manufacturers, which was basically a spy master. He was organizing and paying industrial spies to steal technologies from other countries. But, you know, I mean, everyone did it, you know,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah, next question.
Sorry, over here.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's really interesting. If we accept your hypothesis that in a dynamic sense, protectionism brings development and progress, do you then accept the conventional hypothesis that in a static sense, at this moment in time, if you were to invoke protectionism, the economy now would struggle, or that there would be problems in a static sense, and
Yeah.
people's lives would be worse now?
Yeah, no, in static sense, I think it's generally true that free trade is good for all trading partners. But even there, you have to be careful, because when you are introducing free trade in a country where there was no free trade, suddenly it can destroy a lot of industries, that create unemployment, lead to recession and so on. So, I mean, there's that problem. But if you were to start from free trade, yeah, I mean, in the short run, of course, you have a bigger market, you have less barrier, you can sell more. The trouble is that when that is done, the poor countries then gets to specialize in low productivity activities, and for various reasons, it's very difficult to get out of that.
In fact,